We are now nearly a quarter of the way into the 21st century, which is a great reminder that you are now teetering on the cusp of being old if you were born in the 90s like me. The New York Times also decided that at this moment, this is also the perfect time to release their 100 best books of the century, as decided by authors. And I just thought it would be really interesting to go through the process of how they even put together this list, because the New York Times bestseller list is notoriously and famously opaque. As in, it is a list of the bestsellers, but it has this sort of editorial hand of God that is arranging things, and we don't really know what that process is. But for this best 100 of the 21st century, they actually shared with us some of the details, and so did some of the participants as well. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the details of the process, and then we're going to go through some of the ballots that have now been made public, aka which authors selected which books to go into this sort of experiment, and then the readers lists, as well as what books would probably go on my top 10. So I think there's a lot of tea and a lot of things to unpack, so we're going to just get straight into it, starting off with how this whole process worked. So the Times invited a bunch of writers. We don't know who or how many, but we know that 503 chose to participate. They invited these writers to submit ballots with 10 books each. And there is a little bit of bias in who was asked to participate or who chose to participate that I will touch on in a little bit later. But some of the authors include people like Stephen King, who put himself on the ballot, Rebecca Roanhorse, Sarah MacLean, Elizabeth Hand, Mary Roach, Min-Jin Lee, and they were promised that these ballots would be completely anonymous. They would not be shared with anybody. They were just submissions for this greater experiment. The only guidance that they were given to select these 10 books from the last 24 years was pick your top 10 best books of the century, or pick the top 10 best books of the century so far, not necessarily theirs. So it was left really open, so they could kind of interpret that however they wanted. Then Sarah MacLean, who talked about it a bit in her podcast, which I will link below, explained how once all the ballots were submitted, they put together this sort of game where you would be presented with 2 books, say like Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro and Gone Girl. I don't know, 2 books, and then they would have to select which one was better, essentially. And so you just went through this whole process of vote, and then they released the top 100 books that were voted for. I'm going to share the link of the top 100 books that they've listed with you. I think it's free. If it's not, try and see if you can find a free invite link online if you don't want to give them your money. But let's just start by going through the top 10, okay? So book number 1 is My Brilliant Friend by Ella Ferrante. Then we have The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. We have Wolf Hall. I have not read any of these so far. The Known World. The Corrections by Jonathan Franzen. I have not read any of these. I have not read any best books. 2666. The Underground Railroad. I'm noticing that these are also very American-centric, but later on we do have some translated novels. I mean, Elena Ferrante is translated, and there's a little bit more minority authors, more than I was expecting there to be. Austerlitz. Never Let Me Go. That one I have read, and I hard agree. With that is a great book. I've only read 1 of 10 of the top 10. I think I have not read most of these. They're very... Oh, I've read The Road. Fucking hated that book. They're very pachinko. I want to read. They're very literary leaning, which I find quite interesting. But one thing I do like about this list is that underneath each book, they have suggestions that include some books as well that may have shown up on ballots, but not necessarily lists. So I appreciate that they are not just making like a top 10 or top 100 list. They're trying to diversify because they have like an I've read it or I want to read it. Okay, on this list, the books that I know that I want to read is White Teeth and On Beauty. Both of those are by Zadie Smith. I feel like I should read some Elena Ferrante. The Sympathizer has been on my list for a long time, Pachinko, and Wolf Hall. find very interesting about this list is that there are multiple authors, Zadie Smith and Elena Ferrante, for example, who have multiple books. Partly because Elena Ferrante is, first of all, an anonymous author. We really don't know who this name is an alias for. She is number one, and she has, I believe, 4 books on the list. That has gotten a lot of attention. And I am like a little bit of a side eye at that, because how do you end up with 4 books on the top 100 list? That is like almost 1/20th of the whole list is just Elena Ferrante. That seems crazy. Maybe she's an incredible writer. I have not read any of her books, but now I feel like I have to. And I think all 4 of them are part of the same quartet. Strange. I've heard jokes that some people are like, oh, Elena Ferrante is like secretly one of the 503 people, and she just put her books all on there. But I mean, even Stephen King put himself on this list. Or like on the ballot, and his book didn't even get on that list. But I think it's also possible, like other people have said, that first of all, some of King's stuff is older. When you publish a book a year, you're gonna have so many different books. You might get tons of votes, but it won't be enough concentrated on one single book that you make it onto the list, if that makes sense. So there's definitely some flaws to the system, but I also find it interesting that there is no poetry. There's very minimal genre fiction. Like there's no fantasy, horror, or romance, which I find very unusual, and I'm going to talk about more when we actually look at the author's ballots, because I think that is actually the most interesting part. Although I am really happy to see that the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin made it onto that list. I think that's quite cool. What we do see is a lot of like literary, as I've said, and a lot of like quite bleak stuff. A lot of dystopian. We have The Road, Never Let Me Go, Station 11. So for me, there's a lot of questions about this list and their process. Every list is going to be biased to some extent, but I do have questions about like, how do we judge what a great book is, or what the best books are? And I think the Times also kind of recognized that a little bit, that there is a really strong bias towards literary authors and literary books. They even said in the podcast where some of the editorial team was discussing some of these results that there was a bit of a sample bias. There was an overrepresentation, meaning more people who wrote in the literary genre than people who were genre writers out of that 500 some odd people. You would kind of expect that if you write literary, you're going to pick literary books. And if you write genre, you're going to pick genre books. But that is not actually always the case, which is pretty unexpected. I also want to note, I do think that there is maybe a bit of an age bias in this as well. We only know about the authors who actually made their lists, their ballots public. But the ones who chose to make their ballots public, a lot of them have been in the writing business for a little while, meaning they're a little bit older. And I say that because when we go through the ballots, I don't see a whole lot of books that I would expect people who were coming of age in the last 24 years to have included. Okay, so let's go through a few of these. I haven't looked at all of these yet, so I'm kind of excited. So first up, Stephen King. I like that he puts a lot of thrillers on his. I was surprised by The Goldfinch. I wouldn't put that on my top 10. I really enjoyed it, but I wouldn't put it on my top 10. He put Under the Dome, that is his novel, on there, and I kind of get a kick out of that. But I've actually never read Under the Dome. I don't think I've heard of it. A lot of people have mentioned Sarah Waters' The Paying Guest, which also didn't make it on there. Let's look for someone fun. Let's look for, R.L. Stine. R.L. Stine, I think, is really interesting because he also included The Goldfinch, but I don't see like any children's books. He has Gone Girl on there, which I like. Was an unexpected ballot to me. Who else have we got here? Sarah Jessica Parker. I will be honest, I really don't know a whole lot about her. She put The Goldfinch on there as well. Very interesting. But I also heard that she is doing a lot to save the libraries in New York. Stephen Graham Jones. Stephen Graham Jones has, I feel like he knew the job. He put a really interesting selection here that I absolutely love. And I feel like his book should have made it The Only Good Indians. I have not read any of these. Actually, I read World War Z and The Bear and the Nightingale, but none of the other ones. It seems like there's a few people who went in there with kind of a mission where they did what I would expect them to do. They put all of the genre books that they love to try and get them some more representation. Certainly that's what Sarah McLean said she did, but I think it's very clear when a genre writer made that call, because you have people like Stephen Graham Jones, who I think his selection is fantastic. He's got a bit of variety here. I'm surprised to see The Bear and Nightingale on this list, but he has a lot of like thrillers and horror, and I really want to read that book by Meg Abbott. Dare me? I've never heard of this. Adding it to my TBR. Then you have Rebecca Roanhorse, who not only included other minority authors, she pulled together a great selection of fantasy and sci-fi. And I completely agree. Similar for Sarah McLean, it's all romance. I want to say Dark Needs at Night's Edge. Hard agree. It might not make my top 10, but I just want to be on the record. I do recommend this book. It's about a ghost who's haunting a house, falling in love with a vampire who's trying to get clean from blood madness. And you don't have to read the other books in the series. Very good book. Paul Tremblay, I think, has some real bangers. House of Leaves, The Only Good Indians, Our Share of Night, and The Maniac, Never Let Me Go. So I find it really interesting, though, how many of the genre writers didn't include genre fiction in their list. And I don't want to harp on about this super extensively, because these were personal ballots. They chose to make them public, but I feel like a lot of them probably were sitting down and thinking about what books did I really enjoy or did I think were really well executed. But it is curious to me why those books are often literary. Does a book have to be serious, or can it be fun and brilliant? What do we count as impactful and what do we count as valuable? And then the New York Times invited readers to come forward, submit 10 books, I believe, and then make their own list. But there is some bias I do want to acknowledge here. First of all, they're readers of the New York Times, so that's already people who are probably paying for a magazine or a newspaper that are going to be of a certain demographic, of a certain political leaning, of, blah, 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 blah. And when I'm looking at this list, we have a major recency bias, which is unavoidable. Even when I show you my list, there is a major recency bias. But there's no way that people who read the author selected list were not then reminded of oh yeah, that was a really good book. That should be on the list too, because there's a huge amount of overlap. But we still have some real bangers. I believe Piranesi is on that list. We have a little bit more genre fiction. We have a little bit more stuff that I personally enjoy reading. But what I thought would be more fun is if I share what my top 10 would have been. And I'm going to start by defining how I think about the best books, because I've already talked about books that had a really big impact on me, that shaped me as a reader, shaped my core story as a reader, and probably as a writer as well. I will link that down below. And it's different from my favorite books, because the books that I took the most pleasure out of and the books that I enjoyed the most, first of all, many of them were written before the year 2000, but also they may not be of the highest quality. But what makes a great book, or the best book, for me, a standout book, if you will, is a book that's able to do multiple things at once. It can be deftly responding or discussing a social issue, or playing with interesting speculative ideas while having incredible prose, while having just this amazing, fun, or emotionally devastating impact on me as well. That being said, I found this a very overwhelming exercise, and I have absolutely no idea how people sat down and selected a list of books that then they decided to make public. I can understand why people would not want to share them publicly, because that's very stressful and you may change your mind within 10 minutes. So I put this list together before I sat down and actually looked at the New York Times lists. And I went with a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction. I tried to be a little bit introspective about it, but I didn't overdo it. These are my top 10 ballot books of several hours ago. The Hunger Games, The Seas, Rouge, My Dark Vanessa, Juniper and Thorn, Facemaker, The Only Good Indians, Song of Achilles, A Memory Called Empire, and Piranesi. Okay? Those are my 10 books. I am already changing my mind. I think all of these books had a huge impact on either society, like The Hunger Games was a moment several times over. It changed how I think many people as readers thought about like politics and the world and TV and media, and certainly affected me in a very deep way. The Facemaker is just the best nonfiction book that I have ever read in terms of my interest and enjoyment. My Dark Vanessa is very challenging and kind of a hard book to read, but a really good one, I think. A Memory Called Empire does something really interesting with sci-fi and examining the experience of empire and being colonized, the love and hate of empire, all of those complicated feelings in a really beautiful way. There's just so many good books. There's so many good books. But then when I looked at the New York Times list and reader lists and the ballots, I saw other books that I remembered. I was like, oh, Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez has to be on there. It's an absolutely fantastic horror novel, or horror door stopper, because it's like very, very thick. And of course, Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. There are very few books that have made me sob and have asked such interesting and quietly uncomfortable questions as that book. And of course, there's major recency bias in like Rouge being on my list and Juniper and Thorn. But I think that there's always going to be some bias or some kind of issue with lists like these, which is why word of mouth is such an important way of discovering books and sharing books. And that's partly what I love about YouTube, about libraries like the Librarian Recommends shelf and BookTube. So that leads me to asking you, I should have actually asked you to comment before this video, what are your top 10 best books of the century, but no, it's too late now. Tell me how you would define best if you want, if you can, and tell me what your top books would be. Right here in this moment, knee-jerk reaction, however you want to do it. Let me know, leave it down in the comments. I would love to hear what books I have been missing out on, what books I should be reading next. I found this list really interesting, and I hope that you did too. I hope you enjoyed going through it with me, and I hope that it made it a little bit accessible because it's usually hiding behind some kind of paywall, which is really annoying. Thank you for watching this video. I will see you again very soon in another one, and until then, bye!